Check 1, 2. I think we're good. Let me stand up and do this little picture-in-picture. I don't want that. All right. I'm sure. Super professional. What could go wrong? Good evening. Good evening. Good evening.
All together now.
I came from a meeting to this. It's good. I'm prepared. I'm glad that I did my work ahead of time, or I'd be frantic. That's a good way to put it. All right. It is good to be with you all. There are some handouts that hopefully have gone around. And what I want to do is provide you with stuff that's sort of extra. So you have it if you want it, and if it's not for you, that's okay. I didn't write it. Again, you can throw it away on your way out, and I'm not going to be sad. It will not offend me.
Is there a recycle bin out there?
I don't know. There might be, yeah. And sometimes I feel that way, right? And some of you who've done higher education, right? You eventually your eyes glaze over, and you're like, oh my gosh, these people are writing for nobody. So I try to find like the shortest articles, stuff that's like I can read it if I'm interested. So the gist of the article is talking about revolutionary movements, which I think are really interesting. And it's talking about revolutionary movements within the tradition of the Jewish culture and people, and then also a little bit of the early church, but mostly like that intertestamental period, that Second Temple Judaism, also known as like the time of Jesus. And so, Rome and the Jews did not get along. And that article will talk a little bit more about it if you want to kind of dive down deep. I'm going to double check my audio on this because my anxiety is spiking, but it's fine, it's good. So I already looked once, don't look again. And there's a lot to cover tonight, so it's a very exciting chapter. There's a lot packed in. So we'll begin. Is that all right with you all?
Sure.
Good? We got good weather?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So if you are just joining us or you've missed a few weeks, that's quite all right. I like to do these short summaries as a way to remind myself where we've been and where we are, and also kind of help us memorize, to the best of our ability, some things happening in the Gospel of Mark. So Mark chapter 1 is the story of John the Baptist, about Jesus being baptized. He's tempted and he calls the disciples. Mark chapter 2 is Jesus heals and debates. Mark chapter 3 is Jesus heals, debates, and he appoints 12. Mark chapter 4 is Jesus teaches and calms the storm. Mark chapter 5 is Jesus exorcises demons and heals. Mark chapter 6, last week, right? John the Baptist, dead. 5,000 fed. That rhymes. And then Jesus walks on water. That was the story last week. So, let's begin with a short prayer, and we'll talk a little about messianic expectations shortly, and then we'll move on. Gracious God, we pray that you be with us this evening. As someone, I'm praying for myself, Lord, as someone who's gone from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting and is busy. We're just going to slow down for a moment and to gather in this space, to set aside this time, to hear from you and to read your word and to wrestle with it, to be challenged and shaped and formed. And so, God, we pray that you would speak, for your servants are listening. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen. Oh, how unprofessional of me.
How about JB dead, 5K fed?
Thank you. That would really sync it up. I mean, because John the Baptist is just so wordy.
Yeah.
JB. As opposed to JC.
Yeah.
We're on to something.
Yeah.
Good. So we talked a little about the revolutionary stuff, and I read something else this week that I thought was really interesting. I wanted to share about this idea of Elijah that we've encountered so far. And there are two broad interpretations on this, about this a messianic expectation during this time. People think that Jesus is Elijah, right? Or maybe John the Baptist was Elijah. And there are two main schools of thought. Either that Elijah will come back, right, and be Elijah again, or that someone like Elijah will come back and have ministry like Elijah's ministry. So if you are not an expert on Elijah's ministry, it's okay. I'm not. It's just, we should remember that there's this expectation that Elijah's going to come back, or someone like Elijah. And that's the the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One. And those words are all filled with expectation. And so it's a lot to unpack, but that's sort of the gist of it.
Well, remember, Elijah went up the sky also.
Yes, which is why, he's one who did not taste death and that he'll come back. This is brought to you by Big K Ginger Ale. Okay, so next week, what I want to do, and I had a conversation with some folks last week about miracle workers in the ancient world, right? And we encounter this in Moses' time, right? He's not the only one who can turn the staff into the snake, and he's not the only one who can turn water into blood and blood into water, right? The Pharaoh's magicians can do that. And it's the same thing in the Greek world. There are these traveling miracle workers, these people who can heal people, but they're not the Messiah. And so what I want to do is find some stuff. I'm going to tell you what my homework is. My homework is to find some stuff on this miracle workers in the ancient world. That's kind of a historical thing, and I'll do the same thing I did this week. I'll photocopy it. If it's something that interests you, you can read it. If you want to put it in the recycling bin on the way out, you can do that too. You want to make paper airplanes? Go for it. So that's what's coming down
Not with
the pipe.
staples in it.
No, certainly not. All right. Previously on Mark chapter 6, verse 56. And wherever he went, this would be Jesus, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. Which leads us to Mark 7. A lot of verses. Here we go. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups and pots and bronze, kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you, hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" This question should not surprise you in these first 8 verses. What is something that you notice? What are something that you see as we read it fresh today?
Pharisees are putting out dream again.
Yes. That's the first bullet point I have on my notes, right? Once again, la-ti-da, conflict with the Pharisees again. And that's setting up sort of a tone for this chapter.
Well, and the whole idea about their hearts. That he's not here to make them follow rules. He's here to change their hearts.
Yes, and the idea too that that's also written in the Isaiah thing, right? That their hearts are far from me. So Mark is alluding to another text in Isaiah that's talking about Israel, and here they are again, this age-old problem. What else? I want to just double check my notes. No, not yet. What else do you see?
Well, according to Leviticus, it was good to wash your hands before you ate.
Yeah.
And it was a medical thing, not just a dirty hands thing.
Yes.
And that's why to this day, we tell our little kids or our husbands.
That's right. Go wash up.
Go wash your hands and dinner's ready.
Yeah, so there was this ritual washing, which I want to get into, and now we can take a look at this. So far there's been all this conflict with the Pharisees. We will recall in chapter 2 there was conflict with this table fellowship. They ask you eat in the, how can you eat with sinners?
Yeah.
And these people, the tax collectors and these individuals, right? And then there was a question about the disciples fasting. It says, your disciples don't fast. Tell us about that. So there's more conflict with the Pharisees. And then there was conflict about them observing the Sabbath. Like, can you heal the guy on the Sabbath or not? And then Jesus is like, I'm going to tell you about all that. And then you have this ritual defilement here in chapter 7. And it's all about hand washing. So, believe it or not, I actually have a Jewish hand washing cup. I bought this at a synagogue when I was in Houston. I thought it was beautiful. And it has Hebrew on the script that literally says hand washing. All of them have 2 handles. Any ideas why?
Oh, because if you haven't washed your both hands, you could just eat with a dirty hand.
Well, you're right? You have, my hands are dirty, and so let's say this is my hand washing cup. All right, if my hands are dirty and I need to wash my hands, if you graze it, if you touch it, then you have to wash it again. So the way that you'd wash it 3 times is you'd hold on to this, right? You'd dip it, you'd say the prayer, and you'd wash your hand. Your hand is now clean. And grab the cup, other hand, and such. And this is how they would wash their hands. It was probably not sterling silver, right? It was probably clay. But they were written this way. So Jewish law and custom prescribed hand washing in a number of situations. And in particular, it's in Leviticus 15:11. If you're a note-taking person and you enjoy that kind of stuff. And then the priestly requirements are also found in Exodus 30. So it's in the Old Testament, talking about how they're supposed to wash their hands. The practice is referred to as netalat yadayim, which literally means hand washing. That's what it says here in Hebrew. And here's the text, or the prayer, that they would read while doing this. This prayer is from the Talmud, and we will remember with great clarity that the Talmud is sort of that oral teaching that happened during exile. So, like, Jesus doesn't have the Talmud, right? He didn't go to Barnes & Noble and buy a copy, But that oral tradition that they established in exile is in the water, pardon the pun. It's in the water among the Jewish people. So here's the prayer they would say. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us concerning the washing of the hands. And that's the prayer you pray as you wash your hands. Now you'll notice in Mark 7, 1 through 8, that this whole entire section here, the editor in verse 3, and I wonder if your Bible does the same thing, puts it in parentheses. Does anyone else have parentheses or just this verse? Just curious.
I'm sorry, where?
Mine is.
In verse 3? Yeah?
No, mine's not.
Yours not? Okay. So yours is actually probably more accurate, right? Because I'm going to ask you the question. It's a loaded question. You all know the answer. Do parentheses exist in Greek?
No, probably not.
No. They don't have punctuation, right? They don't even have lowercase when this is written.
Or periods.
Right. They have nothing like that. So it is a parenthetical aside. The editors have determined it's a parenthetical aside, and it sounds rather like a parenthetical aside, right? Because it's rather explanatory. The Pharisees and Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands, yada, yada, yada. If you're an author and you have to tell your audience about something, my question down here, what can Mark's parenthetical aside teach us about his audience?
Probably Gentiles.
Yeah. Because if they were Jews,
They know.
they would know, right? I don't have to waste any ink on this. You all know. But if you don't know, well, I gotta say something. So there is good evidence to support that Mark's primary audience are not Jewish folk. And this is why. Because he's flat out explaining something. And he hasn't explained everything, right? There's been other times when Jesus did something. For example, the casting out of the pigs. He doesn't say, pigs are unclean. Gentiles don't care. They're the ones that raise the pigs.
Bacon's
So-
good.
Yeah, they don't need to have that discussion. So that's interesting that that's here in this text. Doing okay so far? Any other questions about 7, 1 through 8? Before we push on? I know I chopped it up in the middle because I can't fit 20-some verses in one slide. So, all right, we'll pick it up, right? Then he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, whatever support you might have had from me is korban, that is an offering to God. Then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus nullifying the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. And you do many things like this. Then he called the crowd again So there's some players here, right? There's disciples, there's a crowd, and there are the Pharisees. He said, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. Verse 17, when he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, so are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer? Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, debauchery, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. What do you notice about this passage? What observations might you have?
Well, that if you claim that you gave all your wealth to the church, you don't have to support your own mom and dad in their old age.
Yeah. So there's some complexity about familial relationships and honoring them. Certainly.
Seems like the disciples were kind of dull.
Once again, not a very positive light. Yeah. What does he say exactly to them? He says, are you also without understanding? Do you not see? Yeah, and he needs to explain it.
In my translation, it says something about being dull.
Being what?
Dull.
Dull.
Oh, go.
Interesting. I wonder what that word is. I don't have my
Are you so
interlinear
dull?
translation.
It's like the opposite of sharp.
Are you so dull? He
Huh.
asked. That's what it says in my translation.
What else? Other observations, other thoughts? Good.
Well, I really thought that the obvious message in this was that whatever, just what he said, what goes into your mouth goes down to your stomach, but what comes out of your heart is what defiles. It's
Yeah.
defiled.
I think that is one of the
That's it.
key messages. And there's some other stuff here. I don't want to jump ahead because I need to track back on some things that Jesus is talking about. But you're right. He gets down to this, which he calls a parable, which is interesting. It doesn't sound like any of the parables we've heard before. The maxim, right, is in verse 15. There's nothing outside a person that going in can defile. The things that come out are what defile. That's the parable that they have questions about. And we'll talk about why they probably have questions about it. But let's recap what Jesus is talking about here. So he's using Isaiah. Nod your head. He's using Isaiah, and he's arguing from the scriptures. And there are some major themes happening so far. So themes in Mark that are influenced by Isaiah so far, right? You have this idea that the word of the Lord stands forever and will be fulfilled. You have Jesus as sort of this liberator and judge. Jesus has authority and power over everything. That's been shown. And then Jesus also is the shepherd and guide, right? The disciples are dull. They need someone who can guide them in wisdom. And that's Jesus. The crowds are hungry. They need someone who can feed them.
Yes.
And that's Jesus. Right? They are sick. They need a physician. And that's Jesus. So there's all these themes that are in Isaiah that keep coming up over and over again. And so far, it's interesting that Isaiah has been quoted a couple times. And I'll just read them for you. So Mark chapter 1 is about preparing the way of the Lord, make straight paths. I'm the voice in the wilderness. That's out of Isaiah chapter 40. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus forgives sins, where Isaiah 42 says that God blots out transgressions. In Mark 4, you have the parable of the sower, and then that's out of Isaiah 61, where God is the sower. In Mark 5, you have the calming of the storm, and here are the words from Isaiah chapter 50. By my rebuke I dry up the sea, I make the rivers a desert. Another strong theme there. And you have the making the straight paths in the deserts and wilderness and the wasteland from Isaiah 43. The wilderness and dry land shall be glad. They shall see the glory of the Lord. He will come to save you. Isaiah 35. The eyes of the blind shall be opened. Isaiah 35. What has Jesus been doing this entire time, right? Healing. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. Isaiah 40. And here he's quoting Isaiah 29:13, that Israel has been rebellious and kind of religious in form, but they're not really religious in heart. So there's all these themes of the book of Isaiah being replicated in Mark. So these are some fascinating things. And there's this underlying current of what you said about this idea of clean and unclean. I think this bears some bearing down into as we discuss clean and unclean as I think about in the ancient world. What's your understanding of clean and unclean? We've talked about honor and shame a little bit as a social currency. I'm trying to think of the best social currency that we have today. And I like on Facebook, it might be like how many friends you have, or like how many cool pictures you can take, and that's like social currency. You know, like, oh, look, I went to Maui again, you know, whatever it is. And people are like, that's good, and then you get cool points, you know. And like back in the ancient world, it was like, oh, you have honor, you get cool points, and you want to avoid shameful things. Because that's not cool. And you can go sit over there with the dorks. You know what I mean? There's a social currency of the day that is not, it is transactional, but like they don't have it in their wallet. And I equated it to prestige last week as well, right? Like if you go visit the King of England, right? There's a high prestige there. They got the chariot made of gold, and they got the fur coat and the scepter. Like it's like that's prestige. It's a certain class and expectation of how one might act. And we have that in the United States as well, whether it's the CEO of a company or the chairman of a board or you name it, right? There's a certain prestige. You tracking with me? Okay. So this is another social currency of the ancient world. What is your operational understanding of clean and unclean in the ancient world?
Well, it seems as if, and I'm sure these things, when they started, they made a lot of sense. I mean, you know, with washing your hands and avoiding unclean things and eating things that were clean and not unclean. I mean, obviously for health reasons you do this, but over a period of time, they became more than just good ideas. They became part of the religion, part of the tradition, part of what we do. And it's not really about God. God didn't say anything about this necessarily, but over a long period of time, it just became part of the religion. And so the Pharisees, Sadducees were more about religion and tradition than they were about God. And so those things took over the place where God should have been. And they were not bad ideas to begin with, but eventually they were used for bad things.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. So let's flesh out kind of the beginning of it, right? Remember that the Hebrew people are immigrants to this promised land. And they need to self-distinguish themselves from the people. So intermarriage between like the Jews and I'll say the natives, right, the Canaanites, the people who were there, was forbidden because of things like property and God's providence, and God delivered them, and they're God's chosen people, and they were to be delivered from slavery and given this land, and they're Abraham's descendants. So all these covenantal pieces are also playing in. So the cleanliness laws, things like circumcision, right, that's a cleanliness law. So how do you tell if the guy's Jewish or not? You know, it's like, well, is he circumcised? You know, and we're like, oh my gosh, this is, you know, that's cleanliness. You know, they wear funny clothes. They don't eat certain animals. Okay, so there's some cultural distinctions. And there were health reasons, right? Oh, you have leprosy. I'm so sorry. I need you to go live over here in this special place so that you don't infect the rest of us. And there were all sorts of other things as well that played into that. And then it morphs into, we only have cups with two handles, people. If you got a one-handed cup, shame on you, honor shame, you know, because your cup, I can't hold that handle more than once. I'm gonna get it dirty, you know. So like we gotta make it the special way, so that we can do the clean thing. What else is your understanding? I'm going to read some of my notes here, but I want to just make sure we're...
Well, like, obviously, everybody knows about the pigs, but it's also, there are certain birds of prey that you couldn't eat because they are dirty. And they are dirty because of the dirty habits they have.
Yeah. Anything that sort of scavenges, or there's certain
Yeah.
bugs you can't eat. We know about like certain shellfish and other sorts of shrimp. That's a no-no. You know, all sorts of those things. No mixed fibers. All sorts of interesting clean and unclean rules. So let me just walk through some of my notes real fast. I think it's just interesting to sort of peel back the layers of Mark here, because chapter 7 is not just about clean and unclean here. It's about what's happened all previously, chapters 1 through 7. So there's a contrast between the observant Jews and Jesus and his disciples in the Gospels. So Jesus perceives that the Pharisees have this sort of exaggerated concern for purity, but lack more fundamental understandings and concerns for ethics and piety. And the Pharisees are concerned that Jesus is not following the Talmud and the Mishnah, and he's indifferent to the purity laws that they've established. You see the conflict. Jesus is saying, you all are just way too legalistic. And they're saying, Jesus, you are just throwing caution to the wind. We have that we've always done it that way. We have 2,000 years of church history, and you're messing it up. So that's the conflict going on. And that never happens today. No, never happens today. No, certainly not.
If you move the potted plant, you're in trouble.
No, never. No. Leviticus 15:31 says, you must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so that they will not die in their uncleanliness for defiling my dwelling place, which is among them. And there are two types of uncleanliness in the ancient world. There's an uncleanliness that you do on purpose, and there's an uncleanliness that happens accidentally. What are some examples of purposeful, unclean behavior?
Eating without washing your hands.
Okay, eating without washing your hands, because you should just wash your hands. But how did your hands get dirty in the first place? Or let me rephrase mine. How did your hands get dirty, get unclean? That's the right word.
I rubbed a pig.
Okay, right. So if I'm in the market and I'm shopping for food, right? And I touch something that's unclean, that's accidental. And okay, so now I have a law in place to bring myself into correct standing with God. That's actually what's happening, right? And that would be to clean oneself, to set oneself right with the community and with God. What other types of activities are on purpose that could cause uncleanliness?
Well, I hate to say it out loud, but sex.
No, you're exactly right. Yeah, you are. So if you have sexual relations with somebody, that would be unclean, not the act itself, right? And really, sorry, ladies, you're the ones who are unclean. You guys got to wash. Dudes are fine. Rough the hook. You know? That's just how it is.
What made us that way?
Yeah, it wasn't us. I don't know. Yeah. That's just the law, not my fault.
Well, the men have all the rules.
Right. Yeah. And we should be clear, right? The women who are menstruating as well, that would be unclean. In fact, you're not allowed to participate in, I'm going to use this word, in cultic worship, right? You would not be allowed to participate in the body. You would have to be separated until your issue of blood was done, and then you could come back.
That woman.
It was what was wrong with the woman.
That woman that had that touched Jesus.
So I'm gonna read them real quick, just a few. So some things that would cause uncleanliness on purpose: sexual immorality, bestiality, partaking of unclean foods intentionally, practicing wizardry and witchcraft. Also would be causing uncleanliness. So we'll get there. Do you remember the charge against Jesus?
For healing the guy from the roof.
You all remember now?
Um,
How's he doing it?
he's just saying.
He's consulting with demons.
Yeah, that's right.
That's witchcraft.
Oh, yeah.
We're gonna go. It's gonna be good. Okay, what about accidental stuff or necessary uncleanliness? Could be contact with the dead,
Or with sick.
with the sick, or a woman who gives birth, or a woman who's menstruating. these things are also things that lead to uncleanliness as well. So there were special laws for priests, but now I get to ask the fun question. Where has Jesus entered into uncleanliness so far in the Gospel of Mark?
Just about everything.
Just about everywhere. So it's really interesting. Turn with me. I'm going to put it up here, I think, for us. Do I have it up here? Wait. Oh, I don't. Okay. Do I have it in my notes? Yeah, I do. Good. Okay, good. Woo. All right. First, I want to read this from Leviticus 21, and then we're going to go back to Mark 1, and we're going to look through it quickly, because we ain't got all night. But let me read from Leviticus 21. Hear these words. Leviticus 21, 18 through 24. Now, these words do pertain to a priest, okay? So these words are directed towards credentialing for priesthood, but hear the thought behind it in this context. And then we'll go back and see where Jesus is engaged. So, no man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed, no man with a crippled foot or hand, or who is a hunchback or a dwarf, who has any eye defect, who has festering or running sores or damaged testicles. No descendant of Aaron the priest who has any defect is to come near to present the food offerings to the Lord. Did you hear that? Present the food offerings to the Lord. He has a defect. He must not come near to offer the food of his God. He may eat the most holy food of his God as well as the holy food, yet because of his defect, he must not go near the curtain or approach the altar, and so desecrate my sanctuary. I am the Lord who makes them holy. So Moses told this to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites. So Mark chapter 1, we're going to look through Jesus' actions through this lens of clean and unclean. And I'm going to go rather quickly, but you feel free to follow with me. So what happens in chapter 1? We got John the Baptist, yada, yada, yada.
Baptism of temptation Jesus too.
Uh-huh.
Heals a man with leprosy.
He heals a man with leprosy. Naughty, naughty. Who said it, right? Yep. So that would be an unclean action. If you touch someone with a skin disease,
Well,
You're
you have the skin
unclean. Yeah, what else?
Drives out evil spirits.
What about in Mark 1? Anything else? Do we pass it?
Calling of the first disciples there. And he heals a paralytic. Oh, that's true.
Is there anything about someone's mother?
Yeah, mother in law.
Simon's.
Peter's mother.
And what's wrong with her?
She's sick.
She's sick.
Mhm.
All right, so there's two examples already in Mark 1. Peter's mother-in-law with a fever, and then the leper. Mark chapter 2. Again, look at it through this lens, clean and unclean. What is Jesus doing in Mark chapter 2?
Heals a paralytic.
Paralytic man. Naughty, naughty. Unclean action.
Eats with sinners.
And eats with sinners. They didn't wash their hands, right? And I don't mean that like soap and water. I mean, they are unclean. All right, Mark chapter 3.
Must be within the
Heals on
hills.
the Sabbath.
Yeah, healing on the Sabbath.
Well, who is he healing?
Oh, the guy with the bad arm.
The guy with the shriveled hand. The
Yeah.
birth defect,
Uh-huh.
right? Unclean. What else?
Appointed 12 apostles.
All right, what about clean and unclean actions?
Someone was possessed by Beelzebub.
There you go. Yeah, in verse 30, they say he has an impure spirit,
Oh,
right? That'd be, you know, if you got an impure spirit, you're unclean.
They're a demon.
I'll save you the time. Mark chapter 4, nothing.
Oh, good.
Oh, we breathe a little bit because it's parables. Mark chapter 5.
demon possessed man.
Yeah, I wrote down the whole thing. Right, the whole thing is unclean. Right, he goes to the Gerasenes, which we decided was a Gentile land. So he's in unclean land. He has an encounter with demons. That's unclean. The outcome is he's delivering them into the pigs. That's unclean.
Hangs out with them.
He hangs out with the dead girl, right?
Sick
And the sick woman. Unclean, 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 unclean. Mark chapter 6, we read that last week. There's not a whole lot there in terms of that. And then what's the question that Jesus is being asked so far in Mark chapter 7? So we read it tonight. What's the question so far that they're wrestling with?
Well, how could you eat with unclean?
Why aren't you following the cleanliness stuff, Jesus? Yeah. And so it's really interesting to look at this story as it unfolds. You know, there's like this building case against him. They're already trying to destroy him, right? We found that out pretty early. And now they're like, how are you doing this? Oh, you're probably consulting with his witchcraft. Yeah, and you keep doing all the bad stuff, all the chargeable offenses. Naughty. So I think that's just absolutely fascinating. I'll scoot back a little bit. You'll notice in verse 21, Jesus says, it's from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, debauchery, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within and they defile a person. This is a fairly common thing in the ancient world. It is called a vice list.
Oh.
And they are a list of vices. Okay? And there are a lot of them in the New Testament. 30 to 40 of them. I forget the exact number.
That's probably why the person
Yeah.
who's next to the president is the vice.
The vice president, right? All the vice lists.
In charge of
So,
vice.
the opposite of a vice list would be a virtue list. And the most common virtue list would be the fruit of the Spirit that Paul gives in Galatians 5, I believe. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there are no laws, what Paul says. That's the virtue list. Virtue lists where normally teachers would give the virtues and say, these are the virtues. Do the virtues. Right? And then they'd say, here are the vices. Don't do the vices. Right? Because everyone wants to know, what can I do and what can I not do? So I did some research because I was somewhat interested. I thought this was strange. I've read Mark probably 6 or 7 times. I did not remember this, I admit. I'll just tell you right now that this is the only vice list that Jesus gives in all the Gospels.
Really?
Isn't that interesting? I'm sure not what to think of it. That, you know, all the naughty stuff that we usually think of normally comes from Paul. He has way more vice lists. He's got the other 39 or 29 or however many there are. They're all Paul. But there is a vice list on Jesus' lips, or we could say the author of Mark, right? And that's here. Now, the vice list is also repeated, let me get my notes right, in Matthew 15:19. And it's the exact same events. It's a conflict with the Pharisees about the washing of hands, and then Jesus gives the vice list again, and that's in Matthew 15:19. As we talked about, traditionally Mark came first, and so we're assuming that Matthew had access to Mark, and so Mark's going to say, yes, this vice list was found on the lips of Jesus. So it's found in 2 places, Mark and Matthew, but this is the only time that we get a vice list on Jesus' lips. What do you think about that? I don't know. I'm going to just take a sip of my soda and listen to you. So.
Well, what I thought, since you've been teaching this, is that I always thought Mark got all of his ideas from Peter, but I'd say now he got most of his ideas from Isaiah and from Leviticus, obviously.
Yeah.
The Old Testament teaching, most of it.
Yeah. I think I've shared this with you all before. When I was, in youth group and as a young person, I was like, New Testament, yes, love it. Read it, and I don't think I'd read very much Old Testament. And the first time I read the Gospels all the way through, I was like, I know nothing. I didn't have any foundation in which to understand what I thought I knew. And then as I began to read more and more of the New Testament, I was like, man, Paul uses the Old Testament all the time.
Yes, he does.
Jesus uses the Old Testament all the time. I should probably read Isaiah. And you go back and you read it and you go, oh my gosh, like these themes are setting up Israel, right, for some of these things that we are encountering. In particular, and I wouldn't even get to this, I'm going to get to it right now, is the washing of the hands really, really only took place when you were to consume bread. And so, you have Jesus in the Gospel of John saying, I'm the bread of life. It's just all these beautiful parallels. And then, the idea that, the bread was given to the Israelites in the wilderness, and they were given a double portion over the weekend so they could observe Sabbath. All these themes just begin to pile up and build up into the New Testament. So I do think Isaiah is really prevalent in Mark.
Well,
Maybe.
I'm thinking about this and the context, Jesus says here, do you not perceive that whatever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? But it's what he does with that information and how it affects his life and what he does after he digests that. However, if someone touches someone with smallpox or leprosy, can they die? Yes. So it depends on how if you're looking at spirituality,
Come on now.
it's one thing.
Come on.
If you're looking at
Come on.
health issues,
Yeah.
it's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
Good.
And do they go together? Well, yeah, kind of.
Okay.
But, Jesus put himself in the path of ill people. I mean, people who were in terrible shape that literally could have infected him and he could have died, or would have, had he not been who he was,
Yeah,
obviously.
that's
Yeah,
right. He
but
was immune.
it's a different set of circumstances. One is a health issue, one is a spiritual issue, and the Pharisees were trying to kind of put them all together. And Jesus didn't like that particularly, I don't think.
Yeah. Okay.
It seems
That's
interesting.
No.
It seems interesting too that he's given this list of vices to the Pharisees who are committing several of these.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they're saying, oh, how can you haven't washed your hands, you're not clean, all that. And he's saying, well, you're greedy, you're, you're full of malice, you're judging people. And he's saying these to the leaders who think they're so holy.
Yeah.
Well, they're clean, but they do the
They're
things,
clean.
they're clean.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they're not holy.
Okay.
Right.
So I don't want to jump ship too fast, but Paul talks about this, right? He says, I tithe 10% of my cinnamon, like my spice rack. He gets I was a Jew of Jew.
A real Jew.
That's what he says, and he says, but it's all for naught. Because I do not have love, I do not have grace. It's religious in form and not religious in heart.
Right.
And
Having a pure heart.
yes, so Paul talks about that, the circumcision of the heart.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know what to think about that. Yeah, I think Paul and Mark are wrestling with these themes. You guys have probably heard me say that word way too many times, but I think it's the word that best defines our theological task is wrestling. And I think that the Pharisees do not see it. I don't think the disciples see it. I think Jesus is showing them that you can wash your hands all you want, but that doesn't make you right with God and it doesn't make you right with people. It's just an action. But if you do it with reverence, it can be more. So I also don't fully abandon tradition. Does that make sense? I think tradition can still be had with reverence. And what the Pharisees have done is they've lost reverence. And they do it out of identity, or they do it out of, I have to do it, out of duty as opposed to out of joy.
Well, they're more involved with religion than they are with faith.
Yeah.
It's not about faith, it's about religion. It's about doing things the way the church says to do it. And the end result is not necessarily better if they do all those things that the church says or the temple says to do. It doesn't necessarily make them men of God.
That's right.
Okay. We're gonna push on. I think you're right. That's good. Okay. All right. So hopefully that set up some of the conversation for the last two pieces, because there's two, right? We got this one. Yep, that's it. Okay, good. All right. So there's two more vignettes, right? In Mark 7, verse 24 through 30. From there, so where he was, he set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Right? Okay. Yeah, he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. What do you notice about this passage?
Doesn't make sense,
It doesn't make any sense.
not to me.
Oh, I'm with you. I'm with you. I did some research. This passage has always bothered me.
What bothers you? I don't
Well,
know.
I think Jesus is being mean. That's what bothers me. Jesus is being,
Maybe he's testing her.
Well, there's some people that think that.
but what does even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs have to do with Christ's vagina?
Yeah. Okay. So let's dissect this vignette a little bit. Who are the players in the story?
The woman and Jesus.
The woman, Jesus,
The dog.
and the child. That's it, right? There's no disciples, no crowds. In fact, he's like intentionally getting away from them again.
Well, he does with the Samaritan woman too. I mean, he does this a lot.
He does, yes. It's a theme in Mark, right? Or say a theme in the Gospels that there's the private ministry and public ministry. And then who is the woman?
Anybody who's not a Jew.
You're right. She's a Gentile. Yeah, we have some details about her, and they're sort of like, she's a Gentile, 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 Gentile. Do you get it? She's a Gentile, all right? So Jesus
She's
is
unclean for starters.
She is. Jesus is engaging in ministry with this woman who's Syrophoenician, Gentile. She's born over there. She's Gentile. She's a woman. She's Gentile. Right, all the things are lined up there. And this, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to have the children's food and throw it to the dogs. It has been understood in two ways, primarily. Sorry, go ahead.
The children are the Jews.
That's
The
correct.
children are the Jewish children, or the Jewish people.
Yeah, so the way that Jesus is saying this, again, there's two ways to understand it, is that the children are the chosen people. They are the Jewish people. And Jesus' ministry is primarily to come to the Jews. He is the Messiah, the expected anointed one of Israel. So his mission is to come to the Jews and tell them about the kingdom of God. He is to do the Messiah piece that Isaiah has been talking about, that all the other prophets have been talking about. There's some pieces in there that are going to be kind of interesting. Right? But he's supposed to do all those things. So he's supposed to let the children be fed first. It is not fair to take the children's food. That's Jesus, right?
And the word.
And the word, yeah, it's the kingdom of God, and then kind of throw it to the dogs.
The bread of life.
So the dogs, right, that's sort of a backhanded insult at times. And, you cur, you dog. We don't talk like that anymore, But it's not a very pleasant thing generally to say to someone. It is also something that Jews would say to Gentiles. They would call them dogs, right? So it's colloquial in that regard. But it's also a teaching moment happening here. So there's a theological understanding happening that Jesus' mission is primarily to the Jews. Of course, where does all this take place? It doesn't take place with the Jews.
Not there.
So it takes place among the Gentiles. It takes place in Gentile land,
Higher.
with a Gentile woman, with the Gentiles,
Kid.
with a Gentile kid. And so this is all taking place outside of Jesus' main scope and mission, as a way of saying, yes, it's also going to include the Gentiles as well. There's also a practical reading here, and I won't go into it, except for I just said that, and now you're probably like, well, Josh, tell us. And I'm saying, I don't know. So Jesus is resting, and he's getting interrupted in the way that, like, if you were at dinner time, and you took the food off your kids' plates and you threw it to the dogs, you'd be interrupting dinner. So that other kind of practical thing is happening here as well. Jesus is saying, like, look, lady, it's not time. Like, I came here to rest, and they already know who I am, and my cover's blown. Like, can I just rest? And then she's saying, look, you can do this at the same time.
Yeah.
Right?
Good.
The kids and the dogs can eat at the same time, Jesus. And he goes, okay. The demon has left your little girl. So those are kind of the two things that are happening there. Questions about this passage?
I just thought it was interesting that the little girl wasn't even there. Usually you saw the person, get up and walk or whatever.
Yeah.
She wasn't even there. So he believed her story, of course, that she was a mom and a mother bear, but I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful insight, because there are, like you said, there's times when Jesus touches someone, heals them. There's times when people touch Jesus and they're healed. There are times when Jesus speaks and they're healed and they're there. And there's times when Jesus just says, your faith has fixed that problem, and they are healed. Which goes to show that, again, I'm going to say just some duh things, right? Like, Jesus is powerful. Proximity to Jesus doesn't really seem to matter. He can heal you whether you are there or not, whether you are Gentile or Jew, whether you are clean or unclean. He can heal you. It's a question of, for Mark, he's telling us there's a connection between your faith and deliverance. And again, Mark's audience probably is not Jewish. So he's trying to kind of show them, ask you the question, do you believe in this person and what he can do? Push on. Well, this picture, this was of the healing of the woman. There she is in her little balcony bed. So, all right. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee. So he was over there in Gentile area, and now he's coming back. Shocker, he's back at the Sea of Galilee. So it's home base.
Sidon or Sidon or both Gentile.
A Tyre is.
Tyre is.
Uh-huh.
And Sidon, you said was.
Yes, I believe so. And you'll notice that I did not put you through the torture of showing you another map. But maybe I should have. But that's that. So yeah, I believe that they are, those are Gentile areas. Because he comes toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And the Decapolis, again, is that area of 10 towns and very Hellenized Jews. So sort of a melting pot of the ancient world. And they brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech. This is interesting.
Yeah.
The different kind of healing, right? He's done the lame thing. Boring. Right? He's done the withered hand thing. Boring. The only thing he hasn't really done yet, right? He hasn't really healed anyone who's been blind.
He's probably got a speech impediment because he can't hear.
That's right. Those are connected. And they begged him to lay his hands on him. He took him aside in private, interesting, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears. And he spat and touched his tongue.
Oh.
Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. There's a little picture, that's all I got. We're going to go back to the text. You'll see, you can read Greek too, all right? And there's Ephatha, which is in Aramaic, and that's the Greek translation of it. So what do you notice about this passage? This closes up Mark chapter 7. And I'll tell you that there's a big narrative change, right? Beginning of Mark chapter 8 is going to reiterate some things. There'll be a big proclamation. And then the back half of Mark is different.
Okay.
And so the words that end this section, right, are they were astounded beyond measure, saying he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. So what do you notice about this vignette? Anything that draws your attention?
Every time he tells them not to say anything about it, they do.
Yes. Right? Come
It's
on,
like,
man.
Like I said before, if you tell a little kid, now go home and tell your mom that you threw rocks at my cap, they are not going to go home and tell their mom
No.
Yeah.
that they threw rocks at your cap.
I thought it was interesting too that he had just healed that little girl from afar, but now he puts his fingers in his ears and spits.
Yeah.
You know,
Gross.
yeah.
Yes.
And
Speaking
mine
of
says a
unclean,
little differently. It says with a deep sigh. So I felt like he was getting tired.
No, I think so. I mean, do you notice those details, though, in Mark, into the visceralness of this healing as opposed to the other ones? Like, Jesus is like,
Oh, yeah.
He's there, right? It is like physical, close proximity. I think I already told you that Ephatha is Aramaic, right? It'd be like the heart language of these people. It's not the official language of the region. So I'm going to read something to you. It's just from Isaiah. Are you shocked? All right. It's from Isaiah 35, 5 through 6. It says, "Then the eyes of the blind shall see, and the ears of the deaf be opened. And then the lame shall leap like a stag, and the mute tongue sing for joy." There are these things that happen in the Gospel of Mark over and over again where hopefully you will be astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well." He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak.
All prophesied.
All prophesied. There are 2 more major healings in the Gospel of Mark, if I recall correctly. I think so. I'm pretty confident in saying this. Right, next week will be a healing of a blind man, I believe. And then at the very end of Mark, there's another healing of a blind man. And I believe those are the last miracles that Jesus does. I had a professor that said that if you want to see who Jesus is, you look between the blind men.
Oh,
And I think that's always stuck with me for some sort of haunting reason. That, Mark 8 all the way through, the end of Mark, where there's another healing of a guy, healing of blind Bartimaeus, who is healed of his sight and follows Jesus to Jerusalem, ultimately to his crucifixion. And then there's this proclamation of one final miracle, which is the resurrection. Spoiler alert, right? So don't ruin the story for you. But this is,
we know that part.
some profound telling. I'll end with a couple thoughts, and then if you have any other questions, we'll linger. One is, we've not really talked about this genre of book, and it begins in Mark chapter 1, all the way back there. It says, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." So good news means gospel. It's euangelion in Greek. So this is a type of literary genre. And it's hotly debated, since Mark was probably the first gospel, that he's inventing this genre. There have been other gospels. I'm not talking about like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter. I'm talking about other good news of other people, but they're not like this. And so I say all that to say that Mark is pulling from Old Testament messianic prophecies, and he is writing with the purpose in mind to show you that Jesus is Christ, right, is the Son of God. And then he goes on from there, sharing these things. So I think it's an interesting thing to wrestle with. What sort of genre is this, and what is Mark trying to get across? All right.
I'm amazed.
Are you astounded beyond measure?
I am. Because I just never, it has never been pointed out to me before, and every time I've read Mark, the little stuff at the bottom of the page has it said, and by the way, in case you noticed, much of this is from Isaiah. It may refer to it, Isaiah.
Yeah.
But not in a way like you have brought to us to really notice it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to wrestle with, and I've tried to see how many times Mark quoted Isaiah, and I couldn't find a source, so I was frustrated that it also didn't tell me, which it did.
You mean you couldn't get that on your smartphone?
I couldn't. It wasn't there. What else? Other thoughts you might have about Mark 1 through 7?
No, really, there's so much is on that smartphone. It's amazing.
Good? All right. We'll let it sit. If you're able to make it next week, it'll be Mark chapter 8, which is halfway through. Woo! And then it's all downhill from there, right? Super, super simple.
It may be uphill.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. So let me offer a word of prayer for us this evening. God, we pray that you bring us rest this evening. We give you thanks for the words of Mark once again, and being able to sit in this space and to look through them as they inform our hearts and minds. God, thanks for everyone in this room and all those folks watching online. Be with us until we meet again. Praise all in your Son's name. Amen.
I had a two-handle cup. I didn't want this on your thing. I had a two-handle cup which I took camping with me all the time, and I said it was to hold me up when I was drinking. I didn't realize that. I had gotten at a flea market or something,